All right. Well, firstly, I wanted to say thank you to everyone at Sudic Arts for having me to work in this class. I'm really excited about it. Um, so everyone should be getting after this, or possibly even right now as I'm talking, a list of all of the pieces that we're going to talk about. Um, the way that I sort of envision this class is essentially that we're not going to get kind of bogged down by specific dates and everything like that, or specific historical events and stuff. I just want to give people a chance to hear music and place it in a little bit of context throughout the ages, and that's why it's called Music Through the Ages. So we'll kind of talk about different stylistic trends in music and just how music changed. And interestingly, the first place that I want to start with this is I want to start with ancient Greek music. Now, we don't really think of, the story of Western music beginning in ancient Greece, but, well, it did. They don't have a lot of specific samples of Greek music. They have about 40 or so pieces and inscriptions, but a lot of it was like basically how we use music now as an entertainment. So during theater pieces, plays, during symposiums, which I don't know if any of you have heard of Plato's symposium, but a symposium is basically a Greek party. So so they would have people playing a type of flute. There was also the aeolus, I believe it was called, which was a kind of sounded like an oboe, but it had like it came straight down and forked. I will see if I can show you a picture of that in a second. But the main example that I wanted to play you is Greek chorus music from plays, which we'll kind of come back a little bit to later in some of the talk, because it was very influential for opera, because opera was kind of looking back to this ancient Greek style. Now, the first thing is when we think about Greek music, we often think about Greek modes, like the different types of scales. Like, you have the Ionian mode, which is just our normal major scale. Then we have the Dorian. Then we have, so it just each one going up is a different scale. That's actually not Greek. That's not ancient Greek, but it's kind of become a misnomer that was spread by the church modes. So that was actually church modes. So that was used in the Middle Ages. The Greek modes I would play for you, but I can't, because the piano is not tuned that way. So they would use quarter tones and intervals, which is basically the smallest interval on the keyboard, is a half step. So if you look at what my hands are doing, it's the distance between this white key and this black key is the smallest interval that we've got. So they would use quarter tones, so even smaller than that. So the scales that they use sound really weird to our ears. But there was the enharmonic mode, the chromatic mode. That's not what the Greeks themselves called them, but that's what theorists have gone back and dubbed them. So let me pull up this page here. I've got all of these tracks that we're going to listen to in a playlist. Where is the playlist? And then complete, because it's a YouTube playlist, it's a playlist complete with YouTube ads. So let me make sure there's no YouTube ad first. Okay, yep, no YouTube ad. Now we're going to share the screen. Sharing this. Great. So you should all be able to see and hear everything that's on the Safari page. So if you can't, please just unmute yourself and say, I can't hear. All right. Let's start this. So this, as I said, sounds very strange to our ears. Okay, so that was very strange compared to what we're used to hearing, and this is very alien sounding. Let me see if I can get you a picture of the Greek Aeolus. There we go. Let me share this screen again. There was also the hard part for me with setting this class up was to decide what was important to share and what was not. So I may just go off on digressions about things that I originally decided weren't important, but now have decided are kind of important. So you see, it kind of looks like two recorders put together, and you can also see it in the paintings in the corner, like this Greek painting. Here you can see that it's being played and how it was played. But it's a very, very foreign sound and very different. And I wanted to give you the chance to hear the whole thing, just because I feel like it's important to kind of get a feel for the soundscape. That's also another reason why I made this class a little bit of a longer time, so we could try to hear more of pieces and not have to jump around quite as much. So after this, our next kind of stepping stone would be the Middle Ages, because we don't really know very much about Roman music. We just assume that it was kind of in the same vein as the Greek music in terms of at theater and for entertainment, because Romans essentially stole a lot of their culture from the Greeks in terms of like the religion and theater and all that stuff. So we just kind of assume that it was similar, but we don't actually have as many samples of music from the Roman period. So then we would move to the medieval era and the Dark Ages. So now we kind of come to a split of two different styles of music, which you didn't really have in Greece. And this would be the sacred and the secular. And this kind of persists even a little bit through modern times, but not as much. And this was essentially created because of the church. Certain styles of music were deemed inappropriate for the church, and certain styles were acceptable outside the church. So I want to just play you a little bit of an example of chant, Gregorian chant. The thing to pay attention to with this is it is similar to the Greek example in the fact that they're all singing in a unison, as in meaning that they're all singing the same pitch and there's no harmony or no structure. Just to kind of digress, when I say harmony, I mean something like a chord progression, like there's none of that underpinning in that music, and there's no intervals or harmony like, in the sense everyone's just singing the same note. If this is stuff that people already know, I feel like it's better to kind of go over it just for the sake of being clear. So let me pull up. So yes, it's similar to the Greek thing in the sense of that everyone is singing the same note, but you'll notice that the scales that are used and the notes that they're singing are much more in line with what we're used to, because it's closer chronologically, and it's also, you can kind of see a little bit more of the development of more modern styles of music. But this, going back to what I was saying about what they're calling them these days is church modes. The Ionian Dorian mode, just basically a scale starting from a different degree of our modern scale. This chant does use those modes, those church modes. So so you can kind of tell that because it doesn't sound like our normal major scale pattern, or a minor scale for that matter. All right, so let me pull up this one right here, and then I will share it with you. I clicked out of my playlist here because I wanted to show you the instrument. Just get back to it. Okay. It's playing the Greek thing again.
Life's full of.
We're muting some commercials, and then we will listen to our chant. Now it's, of course, advertising for the paid version of YouTube, where I don't have commercials, but that's not what I want to be doing right now. Probably knows that I'm talking about the commercials. All right. Okay. So this is the introduction chants. So this would have been sung during the first part of the Mass. Now this whole kind of talk that I'm doing was inspired by a class that I took at IU called 401, which we had to learn like we had to learn all of the different pieces of the Mass, like the introduction, the gradual, and we had to learn what type of chant they would be. Everyone hated that class. I really liked it, which is why I'm doing this now. But this you can also see on this video that I'm sharing. I haven't started playing yet, but you can see these kind of notes here. They're kind of a prototype for what we would use later in Western classical music for notation. They're called neumes. And each of these neumes have a different name. And if you know anything about reading music, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 4 lines, but in our normal staff, we actually have 5 lines. So they added a line for our normal modern staff. You can see that thing right there is kind of like a clef, like to tell us the relation and where things start. So that this would be on what they call the fundamental, which is essentially what we'd call the tonic in our music, in our modern music. So it's kind of the home base. It's where everything comes back to. So kind of to show you that. And you can see there are these sort of weird connections between some of these neumes. That was an ornament. So it's to kind of like slide your voice. It kind of shows you how to do that. And we actually had to transcribe some of these, which was kind of difficult. It looks very similar to like modern notation, but it's actually quite different. And if I was asked to transcribe it now, I probably couldn't do it. All right, but let's listen to this introduction. As you can see, this is for Christmas Day. So let's made it full screen. All right, I'm gonna stop the screen share, make sure it doesn't start playing. Next thing, some things that are kind of important for where we're going with this talk is that was what's called a syllabic declamation of text, meaning that each syllable was on a specific note, and that kind of comes up later in the whole in the topic of sacred music, which you'll see in a little bit, because that changed. There were also a lot of different types of chants. That was one where everyone sang all at the same time, but there's also a responsorial chant where there would be one person who would say something and then everyone would respond. That depended on the section of the Mass. Okay, I'm going to kind of group our religious and sacred examples throughout the Renaissance and the medieval ages, just to kind of see the progression. Just because if I keep going back and forth between the sacred and secular, they're so different. They're like completely different things, so you won't completely hear the evolution of one style. So we're going to kind of go through the secular arc and then, or the sacred arc, and then jump back to the secular, just to kind of hear that development. So the next kind of step, and this was like the 1100s, from like 900 to 1100, was organum, which is basically a simple form of harmony where they would add an interval above. I'm trying to, it's not loading this page. Just give me a second. So basically, instead of all singing the same note, wait, what is it? Sorry, it's back to Greek music. Let's get this back. Just give me 1 second. My playlists kind of had an issue there.
The CMP corridor is a...
And now we're playing political ads, which is not... Oh, okay. All right, here's this. All right, so back to what I was saying. Instead of doing specifically the same note all the time, then they just put an interval above. So instead of doing, it would be, which kind of comes out as like the stereotypical medieval music sound. But let's play this for you. Why is it not? Share. So basically, it's still like it's still, wait, this is not what I want to do next. It's still very simple in terms of melodic structure, but there is harmony in the sense of there is more than one note, but there's no underlying structure of the harmony or anything like that. I'm going to stop the screen share. Then we're going to move on to a more complicated version of that. Which it uses the same principle, but instead of just the same interval all the time, they change the intervals. And it's always like a fifth or an octave, or sometimes a fourth. So it's always that collection of intervals. Now, in our modern music, we hear, or not necessarily modern, but in normal Western music, we hear more thirds. But we'll come to that in a second. Share. So this is also a responsorial. I'm gonna pause this right here. You'll have this playlist, so you can always go back and complete any things that we don't get all of. I just wanted to interrupt to say that this is also an example of a responsorial chant, which is what I was saying before, where there's one person sings and then the other people join in. And this is also an example of the elismatic declamation of text. So we had the syllabic declamation of text before, where it's like every syllable gets one word, or every syllable gets a note. This is elismatic, because if you see the place on the screen, I'll just to interrupt myself, if I keep the screen shared, can you all still see me as well? Like a small in the corner? Yeah, all right, so I might just keep this shared just so I don't lose where I am. But you can see right here how this is all the same word. Like all of those notes are all the same word, which kind of ties into where we're going. Now this is Aretin, French composer. A little bit later, this is like the 1400s that we're going right here. Actually, it is a little bit earlier than that, but so this is a motet, which is basically you take a tiny piece of chant that you like, or for whatever reason, and then you build over top of it. You build using those principles of harmony that we just talked about, with the fourths and the fifths being favored. You build something over it. Now, these started to get progressively more and more complicated, and then this is kind of at the end of the trajectory of that complexity. So like the example we just had, they just had a couple of intervals over the chant line. But this, they have 3 other parts over the chant line. This chant line was called a cantus firmus, because it was, which means like a firm voice, because it was the one voice that was borrowed, so it had to stay the same. All right, let's play an example of this. I'm pausing there to also to give you the opportunity to hear more of it later, but also to tell you that that was the end of the first word. So that is the excess that the melismatic and ornamented decoration has gone to. And you can probably assume that the church is not going to be happy about that if you know anything about the medieval church. So I'm going to kind of go to the culmination of this sort of decorated high medieval polyphony, and that for me has always been a show, and the a Notre Dame Mass, which is, all right, let's play a little bit of this. And this is,
Sarah Gideon.
Gonna pause these political ads. Oh, I can't even skip this one. I have to watch the ad. Okay, so this is a Kyrie, which is aside from like an introduction, the first section of the Mass, and the words are only Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison, and those are all the words, and you can see this is 8 minutes. So let's hear a little bit of it. All right, so we'll pause there, but you can see it still uses harmonies that are kind of foreign to our ear, but it's quite pleasant sounding and very melodic. But it really does extend text in a way that I think in 1545, the Council of Trent, 1545 to like 1563, one of the topics after Martin Luther and all of the conflict within the church was how to deal with church music. And it was put on the table to ban all polyphonic church music because they thought that it was not reverent because people were enjoying the music and not worshiping in the way that they should. Which kind of sounds like something that might happen nowadays, because you could see people haven't changed all that much. But then there's kind of an anecdotal story. It's not proved, but it's such a great anecdote that I'm going to pass it along. Supposedly, the Pope at the time was leaning strongly towards banning all polyphonic music. Then he heard the Passe Pape Marcelli by Palestrina, an Italian composer, and it changed his mind. So I'm going to play you the whole Kyrie, which is the same section of the Mass that we just heard. This was written after the showpiece, so you can hear there are some differences in terms of the harmonies. There's more of a move towards thirds as a consonant interval and not just a fifth being a consonant interval. But let's play that.
Life's full of little.
After we get cars advertised. All right, skip. All right, so you can see how that could have conceivably saved Polyphony. Very pretty piece. And I would encourage you, I just want to point out that a lot of these pieces that we're listening to, even though they might be, we're hearing longer portions of them in the whole track, this is the section of a complete mass. So and that lasts about a half hour. So all of these pieces are just sections of larger pieces. So I definitely encourage all of you to go and seek out the other pieces as well. So now we've kind of covered our Renaissance and medieval secular music, or sacred music arc. And so now we're going to backtrack and go to our secular music arc. So first we have just basically throughout the all of the Roman Empire through the Renaissance, basically, we don't really have very much documentation for instrumental and secular music. We have some scores, but a lot of the scores don't specify instrumentation. So basically, the instrumentation is kind of pieced together, usually based on other scholarly sources, when we just have like the song, essentially. And a lot of this was just entertainment and street musicians. There were the troubadours and trouvarets in France. I always get the region confused. Each one was a different region. One was the south of France, one was the northern part of France. The piece that we're going to hear first as kind of an example of early medieval troubadour music is Le Jeu de Robin and Marion, which is just the game of Robin and Marion. So it's basically telling the Robin Hood story. And we'll listen to that right now. But you can see they have a very medieval sounding instrumentation, and that's just kind of come based on scholarly sources. And they have, so they research which instruments would likely have been used for these types of things, and they have that way. Play this. This is not part of it. This is the introduction to the. It's a bit jazzy for. All right. Looks like, oh, cool, it cuts to a different section. I didn't realize that one cut to a different section. It cuts to a different piece there. We'll pause there. And our next, it says my internet connection's unstable. Hopefully you can still see me. There we go. It's gone away. Our next kind of trail with the secular music comes to madrigals, which essentially evolved out of a motet. Because a lot of motets were not, they were based on pieces of chant, but not really religious. They were just, because they didn't go in the church, because they were ceremony, they were just these sort of compositions that people would write, but they hadn't developed into anything for entertainment at that point. But the madrigal kind of evolved out of that, so they decided that instead of basing it off of that piece of chant, they would just kind of create something separate that used the same rules, but this was also a form of entertainment. Now the madrigals, there are earlier madrigals. The ones I'm going to play are a little bit on the later side, so they kind of sound more like the 1500s, like Palestrina, like the Assa Papi Marcelli that we heard earlier. In terms of the harmonic language, but things to pay attention to in the madrigal. Basically, these were what people did for entertainment, because instruments cost a lot, and they still cost a lot. So you didn't have a TV, you didn't have a radio, so if people got together in a group, and they would have these madrigal books, and they would all sing the madrigals. So one of the things that they would get as the entertainment was something called text painting, which kind of is over stuff that we'll be talking about a little bit later. But basically the idea was, if the text says, oh, falling down, the music also goes down. So basically the music was trying to illustrate quite in a literal fashion what was being said. So this one is an English madrigal, which is helpful because then you can actually, you know what they're saying. But this is as the Vesta was descending. So this just a little backstory before we hear it.
I'm Sarah Gideon.
After we wait for this ad to end. Basically, the backstory is, well, this is Vesta as in the Roman god. So this is taken, like, inspired by classical mythology, and so it's talking about her going down a hill and seeing another maid as she's going down the hill, and the other maid is supposed to be the queen. So she's supposed to be seeing the Queen of England, and there's the whole section at the end, "Long live fair Oriana," which is just essentially the queen. So they're basically ending with "Long live the queen." Let's play this, and just pay attention to if they're saying. There's also one spot where they say she spied another maid. The voices interject and interrupt each other in a very comical way, like, oh, she spied, she spied. It kind of gets that feel, so kind of listen for that. It was a little bit hard to hear because of the recording quality in terms of the text, but there was one part, I'm not sure if you noticed it, but they say, came running down the lane, came running down the lane, and the voices keep going down. That's an example. There was also, then right after that they sing 2 by 2, and it's 2 people singing, then 3 by 3, then 3 people sing, and then together everyone sings, and then they say, leaving their goddess all alone, and it's a single person. So it's just kind of humorous, very literal depictions of what's being said in the text. Moving on to another madrigal, which is a little bit later. I'm to include it because this is one of my goals with this was to talk about a lot of music that people might not have heard, and just stuff that's not off the mainstream. That's why I'm spending more time on the earlier spectrum, and I'll also spend a little bit more time on the later end of this, like the more recent stuff, just because we kind of focus on everything in between a lot. But I'll still talk about that. Also, just while I've digressed, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to interrupt. Yeah. And also, if anyone needs to run out for anything, feel free. I might just keep talking, but it's being recorded, so. Okay, what was I talking? Oh, yes. So this is Carlo Gesualdo, an Italian composer. Wrote a lot of these madrigals, and
When I first saw this,
kind of a character. He's known for finding out that walking in on his wife having an affair, and he killed both of them. So that's kind of his historical act that people know him for. Not a very nice guy, like a lot of composers like Wagner, problematic life. But his music is very contemporary sounding, and it uses harmonic structures and devices that we don't really get until the 20th century. That's why I wanted to play it. Like if you think about that piece that we just heard, you could almost hear that harmonic structure. It wasn't intentional, but their rules that they created essentially led them to it. And it wasn't until like 1726 that the French composer Rameau wrote a treatise on harmony that actually codified what I just played, that structure that underpins everything. But they were kind of using it before that point, before it was identified. But this just kind of uses those rules and bends them in very strange ways. There is one part at the end where this is in Italian, so it's a little bit less obvious, but there's singing about pain, and the interval and the harmony that he uses there is just very strange. But let's listen to this. Go back to the beginning. There was also that online, another good example of text painting, and that was spenti. The word means sigh, and that all of that really fast going downward motion was sort of illustrating that sigh. But you could hear that there were some very strange harmonies, and there were some cadences, which is essentially the harmonic term that we use for like ending in the location that we're expecting to end at the start point, that ended in just places. So it's like you're going along and then all of a sudden the music abruptly stops. And it doesn't really make very much sense, but it's cool because it's very, very abnormal. The next thing that we're going to talk about kind of goes back. Out of our topics, you can see we go back a lot. And people look back on older music and older styles of music very, very frequently. This is the development of opera, and I'm not going to spend. Opera is actually one of my favorite topics to talk about, but I felt like if I incorporated that into this, then it would be like a 6-hour class, and I didn't want to do that. But I did actually do a talk on opera that's up on YouTube. So if you like the opera topic, you're welcome to go and find that with the Winter Harbor Music Festival. And I purposefully made it so there's very little crossover between the two. But this is one that's a little bit of a crossover. This is a development of opera was this group in the late 1500s called the Florentine Camerata. Basically, they wanted to recreate ancient Greek theater. And as we saw from that piece that we started with, the ancient Greek theater, the choruses were sung. Now, they didn't really know that the choruses were sung in ancient Greek theater, and I mean, honestly, we don't completely know to what extent what was sung in ancient Greek theater and how much music was incorporated. We just know what we know from sources, and that could change. But at that point, they were under the impression that all of ancient Greek theater was sung. So they thought that everything throughout the whole piece would be sung. So they developed this technique called stile recitativo, which was used throughout opera history after this, but in a very different form. Basically, the idea is you play a chord and you sing over that chord. So you play, so it's like, I think I'm going to go outside because it's a little bit hot in here, and now I'm going back home. Something like that. Because then they thought the most awkward transition in opera would be the transition from speaking to singing, which, if you've seen modern musical theater, it is a pretty awkward transition. Like the guy's doing the monologue on stage, and then the band kicks in, but it just doesn't really work very well, that transition. And they saw that issue, so they decided, well, let's just sing everything. And the Greeks did it that way, so we're going to try to do it. So they developed this recitative style. I think I have an example of that. Yes, I do. No, I don't. Well, it may appear in here. But this is basically, this is not the first opera. This is the first sort of relatively frequently performed, if by frequently you mean like not very frequently, of these early operas. There were two prior to it. There was the first opera was, I believe, 1588, Daphne, by Jacopo Peri, and then he wrote an Orfeo, also Jacopo Peri. He was a member of the Florentine Camerata. And this was, I believe, 1606, but this opera came after those, so they had kind of laid the groundwork of the recitative. And basically, those earlier ones, we don't have Daphne, but we have the Orfeo that Peri wrote. Basically, it's just recitative throughout. So there's no, it's basically as if someone did their lines sung. So there's no real musical structure or anything like that. It does, the harmonies and the direction of the notes kind of illustrates some qualities in the music, but not very much. It's mostly just sung speech. This incorporates that style, but it also heightens it in the sense of it was considered during this time that the recitative was the more expressive part, because you could accent things with your speech and with time, whereas later on in opera it was considered not as expressive, and the aria was the expressive part. So here we have, so basically this piece, this Orfeo, Monteverdi Orfeo, was kind of an assemblage, to use an art term, of different styles, of popular styles of music in that day, that was all strung together. But so there were like popular songs and dances, and there were madrigals, and they were all kind of pieced together with this recitative. So this is one of the songs from it, which you can tell it has a strong feel of the secular song that we heard earlier, the troubadour song that we heard.
dei miei lunghi aspri tormenti, quando i sassi ai miei lamenti rispondean fatti pietosi. Ti ricordo boschi ombrosi, ti ricordo boschi ombrosi. Dite allor non vi sembrai, dite allor non vi sembrai, d'ogni altro sconsolato, por fortuna stil cangiato, ed avvolto in festa e guai. Dite allor non vi sembrai, d'ogni altro sconsolato. Dissi già mesto e dolente, dissi già mesto e dolente, or gioisco e quegli affanni che sofferti ho per tant'anni fan più caro il ben presente. Dissi già mesto e dolente, dissi già mesto e dolente. Sol per te bella Euridice, sol per te bella Euridice, benedito il mio tormento, dopo il qual vi è più contento, dopo il mal vi è più felice. Sol per te bella Euridice, sol per te bella Euridice. Mirate, mirate, intorno ride il bosco e ride il campo, segui tu volpe traurato, addolcir l'aria insieme a tuo giorno.
You can tell from that ominous look on the stage that he had. But if we all know the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, then yeah, it's to be expected. You were also able to hear at the end of the song, you were able to hear a little bit of an example of the recitative style, just kind of sung text over an accompaniment. That was accompanied recit, so it was with more instruments in the orchestra than normally would be, but it was still an example of that. Let's look. This whole production is also available online on YouTube, so I would encourage you to watch this whole thing. It's great. The Orpheus story was used a lot throughout opera history because people had very strong and often changing views about the powers of music. So during this time, it was thought that if you sang something with enough emotion, and that emotion could be imparted to your audience. and which is essentially what Orpheus did in the Greek myth. He would charm people through the expressivity and his playing. So that's why, because he's kind of a symbol of that ability of music, which is why it was very popular during his time. But now let's listen to a madrigal, and this is a madrigal from Orfeo, same opera. And that's actually going on to the song that you just heard, if you recognize it. So that's basically just two of the specific styles that were kind of fused into that opera. And now because we spent so much time on the Renaissance and early music, we're going to kind of skip over some of the earlier Baroque music, which is a shame. And actually, Monteverdi is technically considered a Baroque composer, although this opera is also technically placed in the Baroque period. But I really hear this as Renaissance music. It has more of the Renaissance style feel to it. If you listen to some of Monteverdi's later operas, like Incoronazione di Poppea, that sounds more like a Baroque opera. But this has a very strong Renaissance feel because it's so early and so close to the development of opera. Next piece, we're kind of moving into the high Baroque. Actually, we're coming to J.S. Bach here, and we have skipped over Rameau and a lot of earlier composers. Rameau I kind of mentioned in passing because of that treatise, but basically Bach was essentially writing in an older style, so he was kind of the end of the Baroque period. His music was the culmination, but was considered kind of old-fashioned in his day. But because he sort of articulates so many of the topics of the Baroque so well, that's one of why I chose his music. And also just because you have to have some Bach if you're going to talk about the history of Western music. The piece that I'm going to play, I'm not going to play all of it because this is just book 1, and this is an hour and 47 minutes, is the Well-Tempered Clavier. Just to explain a little bit about what that means, it's a collection of preludes and fugues, a prelude being essentially derived from an improvisation. So like you sit down, you're going to try the piano, and you go. All right, I tried the piano, now I'm going to play my main piece. But these are more complicated than that, obviously, but that's kind of what it derived from, because some early Baroque preludes were just essentially a couple of broken chords like I just played. Or they weren't even written into the suite. It was just expected that they were played. So these are preludes and fugues. A fugue meaning, it's from the Latin to flee, and it means that what you have a very specific structure in a fugue. You have a subject and a counter subject. Now your subject is essentially a short melody, and this melody appears throughout the fugue, but so you'll have, the one I'm going to play you, I believe, is a 4-part fugue. So it's as if you have a 4-part choir singing, but it's all played by the keyboard. And this voice is kind of passed throughout. I remember as a piano student, I would have to do, I had a teacher a long time ago as a kid who would have us draw what they called the yellow brick road on the score, and I played a fugue, which is like you highlight this subject as it moves through the different voices on the page. Now the subject is paired with what's called a counter subject. The counter subject just is what is handed off from the subject after the subject is done. So the subject will finish, then it'll go on to play the counter subject. But while the counter subject is being played, the other voice starts playing the subject. So you get kind of a staggered effect. A kind of less complicated version of this is kind of row, row your boat. That's not around. You know how you go row your boat, and then the next person goes row, row, row your boat, and you're all singing it at the same time, but just offset by time. It's kind of like that, but it's embellished a lot more. And then the other part of this is the well-tempered aspect. So prior to this point, instruments were tuned using what's called Pythagorean tuning, which is based on the Greek philosopher Pythagoras, who found the overtone series and measured the overtone series. And he found that this interval of a fifth that we have in the piano is actually incorrectly tuned the way we have it in the piano. Because if you tune to one specific note, you can only play in certain keys on the piano. A key being, this is one key, then that's one key. But you can only play in a certain select few of those keys if you tune correctly with the Pythagorean tuning. So what they did for temperament, for well temperament, is they made that fifth a little bit flat, so it's a little bit incorrect, but that means that it sounds to our ear when we play in all of the keys on the piano, it sounds better to our ear. Because there were always keys that people would be like, oh, we're never going to play anything in the key of E flat major or C sharp major, because it just sounds too weird because of our tuning system. So there weren't really pieces written in those keys. Excuse me. But this piece, after the development of this temperament system, composers like Bach realized, wow, we can write pieces in every single key in the piano. And in the piano, we have 12 keys. Because you get back to the top and then you're in the same place again. So all of those keys and the minor keys as well, you can write a piece for now. So this, he went around the circle of all of these keys twice, and this is the first book of that. Prelude and Fugue, the first Prelude and Fugue from this book.
Hello, everyone. I have something to ask you.
All right, after we mute Biden. All right. You've probably heard this prelude as well. Okay, so that was the first prelude and fugue. I hope you were able to hear kind of what I was talking about the fugue subject and all of that moving throughout. It's a pretty good example of a fugue. That's one of the reasons I chose it. Also, because that prelude is quite well known, and that prelude also shows kind of the derivation of the prelude style that I was talking about before, with like the broken chords and stuff to get ready to play, because it all is essentially broken chords, but it just goes on for much longer than you expect, and it also still has that improvised feel of the prelude as well. The next piece, which for some reason it didn't come up on the playlist, unfortunately. I will grab it from here. There. This is one of the Bach Brandenburg concertos. Now, I chose one of these concertos because we're going to talk more about concertos later, and this is kind of a style that's that's important. Basically, I have to wait for that to start. Basically, the concerto at this point was a collection of like an orchestral collection plus a group of soloists. So there was a section for everyone to play, and including the soloists, and then there were sections for just your soloists. Now this evolved into what we're going to talk about a little bit later in terms of the concerto, but this is what it started out like, the concerto grosso, or larger concerto. Actually, the word concerto comes from concertare in Italian, which means to fight. So it's essentially a fight between the large group against, or between the small group against the large group. And later on, not as important in these concertos, but I mean to some extent true, the small group is kind of the outnumbered one, or the small group, or later it's going to be a single instrument, is clearly the outnumbered against the large orchestra, and they have to in some way show off their technique or their technical prowess or their artistry in order to win the conflict between the orchestra or the larger group between the orchestra and that small soloist. So here's an example. This is one of the Bach Brandenburg concertos.
It's water. Hey. Your stick is like behind you. Ooh.
I hit pause. Didn't mean to do that. So we'll stop there at the end of the first movement. I would encourage everyone to listen to the rest of the piece. It's not on this track, but I'm sure it's close by. But that was the first movement. And in case you had any doubt as to if the small group or the large group won, there was that huge harpsichord, a cadenza, at the end, which kind of really hammered that idea home that the soloist gets to show off their prowess. And that was actually the earlier Brandenburg concertos don't have that, and the harpsichord mostly just works as a continuo, meaning it just kind of fleshes out the harmony. I remember being asked to play Brandenburg 4 and thinking it was Brandenburg 5 and being like, I think I need more than a week to learn that one. But luckily that turned out to be Brandenburg 4, which is more of the continuo part. Although I would love to play that at some point. All right, moving on to our next piece I got off the list here. Our next piece, I believe we're going to start to talk about sonata form. I just need to, okay, yes, here we are. All right, so we're going to talk about this structure of sonata form a little bit before hearing our next piece. And then actually the piece after that I was going to play you is kind of a comic rendition, which I don't think we're going to completely have time for, but I will encourage you to listen to it. I'll explain it after I explain the sonata form and we listen to this piece. The idea of sonata form is you have two themes in what's called an exposition section, and this section it's exposition as in you show off these themes and you present them, and it's like, here are these two themes that we're going to be working with in this movement of a piece. Then you move to a development section, which based on its name, you develop those themes and you kind of play around with them and see what you can do with them, change the keys maybe, and you sort of toy with them, fragment them, play sections of them. Then at the end of that, you move towards the home base in your recapitulation, or recap as it's called for short, which basically in the end, basically presents those themes again and completes the piece. On occasion, you'll get a coda at the end of the piece, which is Italian for tail. It just means a little bit extra at the end. I like to kind of think of sonata form as the exposition presents a problem, then the fleshes out, and recap solves that problem. And usually when we talk about problems in music, it has to do with keys. So in this piece, you're going to hear in the exposition, you will hear the first theme is this really dark and broody minor theme. And then the second theme is in the major key. But the symphony's overall key is not in the major. So that's a problem. That's a presented problem. Then in the development section, they're kind of toyed around with, and it's kind of a tornado of events. And then at the recap, the first theme is in the minor like we expect, and the second theme is in the minor also. So that problem has been solved in the recap by what has happened in the development. So let's listen to this. This is the Mozart Symphony number 25 in G minor.
Hey, my family is...
I should just talk and assume there's going to be an ad. Now we're coming into theme 2. This is our closing theme in the major key. Then this is a repeat of the exposition, which is frequent. Now we're moving into the development. Then the recap. Now theme 2 in the minor. coda. All right, pause there. Again, that's only, it says, well, it is actually the complete piece. There's about 10 or 12 minutes more left of that piece. I'd encourage you to all listen to it. The next piece, which I was going to play and is on the list, I'm going to skip just for time reasons, but it's basically, it's Beethoven 5, which everyone knows Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, but it's narrated kind of like I just did for structure and form to show you where the divisions of form and structure are by a professor at Juilliard. But you wouldn't, it's not narrated in the way you'd assume. It's narrated, he has this character that he's developed called PDQ Bach, which is supposed to be one of Bach's long-lost sons, who he, as a professor, found. But, so this particular narration is in the style of a sportscaster. So it's quite hysterical, and I'd encourage you to all listen to it as a way of reinforcing sonata form. But we're going to skip over it for right now. The next thing I want to play is a Schubert lieder, and these lieders kind of derived from the medieval secular song and the Renaissance song, and just derived from that style of like street musicians singing, or singing at a pub or something like that. But he kind of elevated it to a much more complicated style than what it was prior. There's actually a version of this same text that I was going to, of the song I'm going to play you, by an earlier composer about like 50 or so years earlier. And basically the accompaniment is, which once I explain the character of the song will not make any sense. So it was just a vehicle for the singer to like sing the tune. But what Schubert did, kind of hearkening back a little bit with another of our themes of looking back to earlier styles, he did his own version and a different style of text painting, which we talked a lot about in the madrigals, like with the running down the lane, the voices going down, and leaving their queen all alone with a single voice, stuff like that. So this song is called Der Erlkönig, which is the Elf King. The poem's story is about a father riding with his son on horseback through the woods, and his son is ill and dying. And his son starts to hallucinate, or you don't really know if the son is hallucinating, but his son starts to sing or say, "Father, don't you see the Elf King there? Don't you see the Elf King trying to take me away?" And then eventually we get to hear the Elf King as a speaker, and singing to the child, singing, "Oh, you lovely child, come away with me, we'll play all sorts of games." And you'll hear a shift in character in the music, and also this specific singer, Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau, really shows that well in terms of the quality of his voice and also his expression when it switches between the characters, because the father sings some of the text essentially, the son sings a little bit, and also the Elf King. And the Elf King's pleas to the child become progressively more, he says, come, we'll play, you'll play with my daughters and my family. And then finally the Elf King says, "If you're not going to come, then I will take you by force." And then the song ends with a recitative, which the characters and says, "And in his arms the child was dead." And this is a poem. This is a Goethe poem, incidentally. I didn't mention that before, but let me pull this up. You can some things to pay attention to is the
Disney.
The character of the overall music when the different people sing. The father has a much lower range in the voice. The son sings much higher in the voice, and the Erlkönig the Elf King just sounds really creepy. You can also pay attention to this figure. I'm playing with 9 fingers here because I have an injury, but this octave pattern in the right hand, this essentially goes for the whole 2 minutes of the piece. That's the horse galloping. So you can hear the horse running with the octaves in the piano. So just there's some things to listen to. I'm going to start it over because I had it muted from the commercial. That was the narrator, now we have the father speaking. Now the child. Now the elf king.
Tanzen und singen dich ein. Mein Vater, und siehst du nicht dort, Herr Königswächter am düsteren Ort. Ein Sohn, ich sehe es genau, es scheinen die alten Weiden so grau. Ich liebe dich, mich reizt deine schöne Gestalt, und bist du nicht willig, so brauch ich Gewalt. Mein Vater, jetzt fasst mich an, der König hat mir ein Leid getan. Dem Vater grauset's, reitet geschwind, hält in Armen das ächzende Kind. Erreicht den Hof mit Mühe und Not. In seinen Armen das Kind.
It's a very cool and very creepy song. It's one of my favorite of his songs, and it also kind of ties into one of the tenets of Romanticism, which I haven't really. We have arrived at the Romantic period, and I've been talking for a while, so I forgot to mention that fact. We tend to think of the Romantic period, or a lot of people who haven't heard of what it is in terms of the arts think of like romance novels, but that's not what it is. It has to do with an increased interest in the natural world and also the supernatural world, like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, romantic literature. This is an example of interest in the supernatural because of essentially being chased by this evil elf king. Also, one other little text painting thing that I wanted to point out from that is at the end, before that little recitative that you have saying that the child died, you can kind of hear the horse slowing down, which is very cool. You can hear the music slows, and just something to listen to if you go back through the list. Moving further into the Romantic period, we're going to jump ahead to Brahms. Now, we talked a lot about sonata form with this piece, or with the Mozart piece that we talked about before. That still applies to this Brahms piece, but on a much larger scale. I'll see, I forgot exactly how long the first movement is, but I'd like to be able to play the whole thing. Basically, also the way that Brahms composed, it's an interesting thing to listen to beyond just the sonata form. He would take these very small ideas and develop them into essentially the entire piece. So at the beginning of this piece, I think in music theory, people who've analyzed Brahms specifically kind of refer to that as a seed, because it's a seed that is in the beginning and it grows to something larger. Beethoven also composed a lot of his pieces like that, so this was kind of a borrowed and developed technique from Beethoven. So we're going to listen to the Fourth Symphony in E minor, and just right off the bat, we have that small kernel of an idea that's developed throughout. Let me bring it up.
While Americans battle.
Radio will play after ad. The hard part is that if I talk during the ad, then I'm just distracted by everything that's on the screen. So, okay. So you can hear that falling interval, that da-dum. That is your seed that generates throughout the whole thing. Let's start it over. as much as I'd like to keep listening to that, I have my list of a bunch of other things that I just realized that, yeah, there's a lot more that I wanted to play, so I don't want to lose it. But I would encourage you to all to go back. You should have all gotten this playlist of all of these pieces here. Yeah, in the first movement, we probably couldn't have, it was about 15 minutes. So the next piece that I want to talk about is the Chopin Piano Concerto No. 2. This was actually originally published first, even though it's the second concerto. And we kind of left the concerto way back in the Baroque period, and it has come a long way since that point. I'm trying to get this Disney Plus ad going, so it's... so since the point of the Baroque, we had... Let me just wait till this... Okay. The concerto kind of pared itself down a little bit. So instead of a small group and a large group, now we have a solo instrument, a solo instrumentalist, and an orchestra. E.P.E. Bach was known for his concertos, and he influenced Mozart pretty heavily in terms of concerto form, which they kind of laid the groundwork for this romantic concerto that we're going to hear. The concerto form of the first movement is essentially the same structure as the sonata form, except there's two expositions, one for the orchestra and one for the soloist. And it's the same type of a structure except for that. And I wanted to at least, if we can't hear this whole movement, to show you those two expositions, the one for the orchestra and one for the soloist. And they cover pretty much the same material. Oftentimes, the piano exposition will be interrupted by, will start with kind of a soliloquy. So not literally what the orchestra had played before, but just kind of a few measures of a solo inspired by it. And it's not something that has been being improvised, it's something that the composer wrote. The second other big difference that you kind of saw a little bit in the Bach concerto was the cadenza. At the end of a concerto, there is a big showpiece, essentially, that was intended to be improvised. Kind of like the harpsichord thing that we saw at the end of the Bach piece, but this is a little bit more different and developed. So we're going to listen to at least the two expositions of the Chopin Piano Concerto, performed by Arthur Rubinstein, who is one of my favorite, if not my favorite, pianist. So. Sorry. All right, well, it's hard to stop listening to that. But yeah, it's amazing, and the variety of tones that he's able to create, and the tone, color, and sound that he creates is amazing. So many pianists that you hear nowadays just play everything with the same tone quality, and it's a little bit disheartening sometimes. But that's enough of a rant of the current state of music. Our next piece that I want to go over is, if it will let me out of this. Oh, it really wants to keep playing it. Our next piece that I want to go at romanticism from a slightly different angle. This is Berlioz' Symphonie Fantastique, which means fantastic symphony, but oh, where did it go? It just left my list. But not fantastic in the sense of great, fantastic in the sense of fantastical, like out of this world. So basically, this is, I'm just pulling it up on a different page, that's why it accidentally left my playlist. I'll change that so you have access to it. Okay. Basically, this is what we call a program piece, meaning not because of a concert program, but program music in the sense of it has a story behind it. It's a 5-movement piece, and it's Berlioz, the story goes, was inspired to write this because of an actress who he had romantic interest in, who was not really particularly fond of him. Though I think that realistically he had very few interactions with her, so it seems a little bit far-fetched and extreme. But the story is the first movement has the subtitle Daydream here, and it's basically this, in the context of this story, it's a poet, and he's daydreaming about his love. And there is a theme for her that I'll play you that comes back throughout this whole piece. And then the second movement is at a dance, and at one point in the dance he sees her, and you can hear the whole orchestra melts away, and you just hear her theme. The third movement is a pastoral, meaning it's outside in the wilderness. And there really is not an appearance of her theme in this, but it's towards the end you can hear a storm, which kind of indicates what direction the overall story is going of this. And then the fourth movement, supposedly prior to the fourth movement, he falls into an opium-induced slumber because this was the days of opium. And so he dreams that he has killed her, and he's being marched to the scaffold to be executed. So there's this whole joyous fanfare of him being marched to the scaffold, and her theme appears at the end, but is quite literally cut short in kind of a musical, a little bit of a joke, but quite graphic illustration. Then the fifth movement, you'd think that the fourth movement would be the end of it. The fifth movement, he is essentially in hell at the witch's dance, the witch's Sabbath, and he sees her. She appears in sort of a grotesque witch-like costume, and the theme has kind of mutated into that, and you can hear that. So I'll play you some excerpts of the first movement and the last movement. Internet willing. Oh.
Get closer.
Oh, come on. We already saw the ad. Okay. Here comes her theme right now. All right, we're gonna skip ahead to this should be the end of the March to the Scaffold, so we can hear how that theme is cut short, literally, after an ad. Here's her theme. Then this is the beginning of the fifth movement, which is Sabbath. So I'll pause there. So you can see it's become, the theme of his beloved has become a grotesque dance. And that kind of also ties into some of the other tenets of Romanticism, like the interest in the grotesque. And this also ties into the supernatural as well, because, you know, it ends in hell with a bunch of witches. All right, moving forward, I would also, as with everything, definitely encourage listening to that whole piece. It's great, and it's a journey, because you hear the development of that theme throughout. And I just kind of gave you the development of it in a nutshell. All right. Next thing, we're going to do a brief little detour into Impressionism. If I have it. Yes, I do. So this is a Debussy prelude. Prelude, again, deriving from the preludes that we talked about with the preludes and fugues and before. But by this time, in the Romantic period and also later, prelude just became to be like a short piece, and eventually a short, what they call a character piece, which is just a piece that that has a specific character. Essentially, that's why it's called a character piece. And they're often inspired by the specific title or a piece of poetry. This is the Debussy Sunken Cathedral, which is inspired by a myth in the north of France about a cathedral that sank, kind of like Atlantis, and then that type of a legend. But you can kind of hear references to like chant and church bells in it. You also hear kind of the Impressionist style. Some things to listen for in terms of the Impressionist style are whole tone scales. So on our normal scale, we use a major scale or a minor scale. Whole tone scale is kind of what they use as a dream sequence in cartoons. So there's a lot of those scales. There's a lot of washes of color, which is often why we use the term Impressionist, just the same term that we use for Impressionist painters. Although the musical movement, Impressionism, was also tied into symbolist poetry, which it actually was in some ways more closely tied to symbolist poetry. Some of Debussy's pieces were inspired by specific symbolist poems, but we kind of group it in with Impressionist painting just because the soundscape created is a lot like a Monet painting or something in that regard. But let's listen to some of the Debussy. All right, we've moved back to some material right there that we've already heard, so I'm going to pause it right there. That's also an interesting recording specifically because it's from a piano roll. Before recording technology, they would use player pianos, and they'd use these sort of rolls of fabric that can be take an impression based on a key, and so then they would have these great pianists come and play, and then get something of their playing onto that roll for other people's player pianos. This was actually a WC piano roll, so it was him playing his own music in some form. I'm sure it's definitely not as accurate as recording, but it's still an interesting exercise. One other thing. Oh yeah. Well, we'll on that later. The next thing we're going to talk about, we're moving into more 20th century music, which is one of the sides that I tried to put a little bit more examples on, but we might not get to all of them, just because it's not as well known. We're going to listen to the parts of the Schoenberg Piano Suite, Opus 25. Now, Schoenberg, Berg, and Webern were part of what's known as the Second Viennese School. This was implying that the first Viennese school was Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, but there was never any sort of association between those composers in that regard. They just dubbed themselves that. And they were pioneers in what was called 12-tone music, meaning, I said before with our scales that we have 12 keys. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And then it starts again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So the idea behind this 12-tone music is instead of creating a melody, you'd create a row or a combination of those 12 notes that didn't relate to any of the previously established harmonies that we talked about before. It was completely outside of that. So it's essentially you create this mathematical algorithm, and then you play around with that mathematical algorithm. You flip it upside down, you play it backwards, you play it with a different algorithm, but you have to use every single note, and you can't repeat notes as part of the row. So it's very, very intellectual in style, but let's listen to some of it. There's an introduction by Glenn Gould here, who's a great pianist known for his Bach playing. I don't forget how long he talks. But I don't want to spend too much time listening to him. Skip.
Which captured the fancy of a very large segment of the public and which have remained staples of the repertoire. In opera, there was Alban Berg's Wozzeck or Ernst Krenek's Johnny Spieltauf. In the concert hall, Prokofiev's Third Piano Concerto and a dazzling First Symphony by an 18-year-old from Leningrad named Dmitri Shostakovich. But the big news of the decade, it can now be seen with hindsight, was a work which has yet to find any real public acceptance, which even a half-century after its debut can still be described as 6 movements in search of an audience, the Suite Opus 25 by Arnold Schoenberg. The reason for its bibliographic celebrity, of course, is that it embodied for the first time on a first-to-last-note basis the system which became known as the 12-tone technique, the method which has sponsored more and more heated aesthetic debate than any musical notion, certainly since Wagner's concept of opera, to which, by the way, it's not entirely unrelated, and of which Schoenberg himself once said, "It will ensure the supremacy of German music for another 100 years." Would you believe 35? When one talks about what Schoenberg wanted to do, one can make his aims sound noble and adventurous and romantic, but when one describes how he went about doing it, it inevitably comes out sounding childish and naive, unsubtle and insensitive. For Schoenberg laid down a set of rules and regulations which, in effect, constituted an a priori notion about what a work should be and do, about the thematic substance on which it should feed, about the way in which it should suspend not only tonality, but also the most favored notation treatment of atonal music, and above all, which compromised what I think we could call the generosity of the ear, the willingness of the ear to interpret what it hears according to what it knows. Rule number 1 for the 12-tone technique decreed that all 12 tones of the temperate octave must be presented as this.
So he's basically going into what I'm saying right now, or what I just said. So I'm going to skip ahead to him actually playing some of this piece so we can hear. But if you need a refresher of the 12-tone technique, it works well. to pause right there. Actually, it's quite interesting hearing him play. He plays very expressively, and it makes the music make a lot more sense than it would. I've heard a lot of performances of this where it's just straight, and it doesn't really work. It's kind of, you have to, as a performer, help in a sense of try to make it understandable for the audience when you play music like this. And I feel like a lot of musicians don't try to make it understandable. They just, well, this is what's on the page, this is what I'm doing. So that's interesting. And also tying into our theme of always looking back, this piece is from a suite. Now, suites were a Baroque form, a collection of dances. So it has that looking back. Bach wrote a ton of suites, and a lot of people before Bach wrote a lot of suites. So it has that hearkening back quality. Let's move forward to Alban Berg. He was also a part of the second Viennese school in terms of this compositional 12-tone style, but his approach to it was a lot more lyrical than the Schoenberg approach. And I chose this specific piece because it's one of the most famous 12-tone pieces, the Berg Violin Concerto, but it's also a lot more accessible in the sense of you can almost hear some shreds of tonality in the sense of that harmonic progression that we talked about before of the one. You can almost hear some underlying structure in that regard. But let's wait for this to be over. And the tone row itself is also pretty accessible. It just starts out with the open strings of the violin and then moves on from that, which is very interesting. All right, I'm going to stop it here so we ensure we have enough time. The next thing is a Webern piece, 5 pieces for orchestra. He was also, the second Viennese school also used the 12-tone technique. His style differs from Schoenberg and Berg in that he used a pointillist approach to use an art term in the sense of there was really no coherent melodic line in the instrumental parts. And actually, this version that we're going to look at, you can see on the score that basically, the oboe will play a note, then the clarinet will play something, and then there'll be a bunch of space. It's more, space plays a more active role in his music than really anything before. Let's get this. Come on, internet, you can do it. Maybe the internet doesn't like Webern. I can't blame it too much. I've never been too much of a Webern fan myself, but let's see. Well, I guess the internet doesn't like Webern, so that'll be something that you can listen to at some point later. Hopefully the other things will work as well. Also, one thing that I haven't mentioned in the context of this style is it was in some ways a reaction to World War I. World War I was just a horrific experience, obviously, for all of the nations across the world, and it was a shared common experience, especially in, I mean, from historical context, we look at Germany in World War I as being, oh, they were the bad guys and stuff like that. But I feel like that's a lot influenced by World War II. And especially after World War I, the Treaty of Versailles really laid the foundation for World War II by just essentially destroying Germany and not giving them the ability to recreate their economy or rebuild in any way. So it kind of laid the foundations for this fascist government that we had in World War II. But this second Viennese school was kind of as a backdrop to the after effects of World War I. And you can kind of hear that distress in the music. But there was also a distress in the music after World War I on this side of the pond, as the English say. The next piece, if it loads, is by an American composer, Henry Cowell, called The Banshee, which you may have heard of from Irish mythology. It's a woman who you're supposed to hear if you're about to be killed on the battlefield. And it's supposed to be like a horrendous shriek. So this uses extended technique, which is basically with the piano or any instrument, it's just creating a sound with your instrument that is not what the sound that the instrument was intended to be to create. So like if I'm playing something, that's normal technique. If I go like that on the piano, that's extended technique. We seem to be having some internet issues. Are you able to hear and see me? Yeah, okay. It doesn't seem, I wonder, hey Pedro, can you go up and see if Harry's on the computer? Wait, it seems okay. All right, I was just gonna see if we can get Harry off the computer in case of bandwidth, but here we go. So this uses extended technique. This uses playing inside of the piano. So pedal down and playing inside the keys. I'm just going to pause right there because there was one other thing that I wanted to point out with that you can listen for on your next time through if you decide to hear it again. And this also ties into the topic of looking back throughout music history. That references a chant. Incidentally, those plucked notes that kind of stood out prominently were a reference to the Dies Irae chant, which is the Day of Reckoning, which is also referenced in the last movement of the Symphonie Fantastique piece that we heard with being in hell and all that. It's a very negative, loaded connotation. Also, if you've seen the movie It's a Wonderful Life, when he's standing on the bridge at the end and he's like, oh, I want to live again, they use that Dies Irae chant, and that goes like... That chant appears throughout so much of music history, so it's a very interesting little side note that I wanted to add in. Where are we going from here? We're going, okay. Now we're kind of taking another step back to a piece by Mahler in order to reference something that's even a little bit more strange than the Henry Cowell piece, but we're going to listen to a little bit of the Mahler Resurrection Symphony because this is used as kind of an underpinning in the Berio Symphonia. So just so we have... All right, I'm going to pause here before going on to the Berio Symphonia. This piece was written after World War II, essentially after both of the world wars. It's kind of the avant-garde reaction to the chaos and strife to create new and a little bit strange works of art. So this is the Berio Sinfonia. Basically, they were also kind of questioning this is like the late 1950s, early 60s, what is music? What makes music? There was a piece that I was considering including by Stockhausen called Stimmung, which means voice, essentially. And it's an hour of people making vowel noises. And I didn't want to include that on your playlist just because I thought that would be annoying if you decided to go through the whole playlist to come to an hour of people going ee. But it is quite a cool piece, and it's quite an interesting exploration of what is music. But this kind of explores it from the angle of what happens if you include speaking in your music. So there's essentially actors in this piece, and they have different lines that are incorporated timing-wise and rhythmically into the music. Some of my favorite lines to keep an ear out for are, keep going. Like, it sounds like the music is about to end, then you hear someone say, keep going. Also, there's one at like a climax point where someone yells out, no time for chamber music, which is quite funny as well. But let's listen to a little of this. And you can hear the Mahler Symphony underneath. All right, let's pause there. It's just an interesting take, and it does music from this period does kind of make you question what you think of as music. There was also a lot of experiments with recorded music, like pre-recording something and then playing tracks over that or playing along with the pre-recorded track. There was also music playing different tracks out of phase. It's basically, I don't know if any of you, I would assume that you've heard the Beatles, and you know that like they did a lot of experimentation with recording and playing with their track mixes, but it's kind of the classical music version of that in the sense of some of the things that composers did during this time. We have enough, the internet seems to be working, so I might just backtrack before we hear our last piece and try to just get a little taste of that Webern. Yes, it's working. So just remember that pointillist style with importance of the space. So you can hear that there's just a lot of silence in that piece, and it plays a very, very integral part. And if you just look at this score that I have paused right here, there's really no coherent melodic line anywhere. It just jumps between the instruments. It just goes kind of all over the place and passes back and forth. The last sort of topic that we're going to cover is minimalism. And in the opera talk that I did, I talked about John Adams, and I talked about Philip Glass as well. I'm not going to talk about him today, but minimalism in opera I really enjoy, and that's a topic that's fun. But I think we're just going to focus on an instrumental piece. And you say minimalism, you think the association for the piano or any keyboard instrument is basically a piece that doesn't really move. And its form is created by large changes in harmony. So I did, in college, I was in a production of Akhenaten by Philip Glass, and basically the whole first scene is an A minor chord. It just does this, and the way that it maintains interest is by changing the orchestration and changing how that figure is worked and how it's quite cool, and it's done effectively. It's very, very, very effective. So now we're going to listen to some of a piano piece by John Adams, who is also a minimalist composer. He wrote an opera called Dr. Atomic, which has become pretty well known and has been performed pretty frequently at the Metropolitan Opera. Also, his other opera that's well known is Nixa in China, which I played an excerpt of in the opera talk. But let's listen to some of his keyboard piece.
With zero sugar.
After this. So I'm gonna pause right there, but as you can see, not that much happens, but what does happen becomes very substantial. So it's all that same sort of broken chord over and over again, and there's very small changes, but those small changes come together to make something that actually sounds like there's a lot going on, even though there's very little that's actually happening. And that's kind of how minimalist composers work. So we have a tiny bit of time left. Does anyone have any comments or anything that they'd like to share, or any other? I'd also be happy to like play some more of some examples or other examples of different styles. I think that they'd probably be happy if we left a tiny bit early just because they have to set up for a streamed concert. But I wanted to give people the option to share some thoughts.
This was wonderful. It's the most interesting thing I've done in 6 months.
Oh.
Thank you.
I enjoyed it. I'm really glad. I hope you'll.
It's. I knew it. I knew it. I knew it.
What are you saying? I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. But yeah, no, I hope that you'll watch the opera talk on Maureen too, and
Yeah, I'd like to do that.
if you're able.
For sure.
Great job today.
Oh, thanks. I'm glad you can make it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I apologize. I had to work, but the the range of ideas was just tremendous, and for someone that's plays an instrument and wants to write, being able to have any sort of background, over 300-400 years of other composers is just, it's tremendous. So great job. Thanks.
Great
Oh
job.
yeah. Oh, and Victor, I just saw your chat message. I'm really sorry about that. I hope that you were able to.
Yeah, it's okay.
To hear.
It was a technical thing on my end. I figured out how to make it louder. Don't worry about it. Again,
Oh, all right,
while
good. Yeah, I don't really. Yeah.
while I have your attention, I was also very much impressed with what you gave us there in 2,000 years.
Thanks so much.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah, it's a lot to cover in
Yeah.
a short amount of time. So.
Right.
Well, I can see the group here for their live stream concert, so I should probably call it a day. But I'm glad you were able to join, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Yes, very much, very much. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye. Awesome. That was wonderful.